Thank you all today. It's always a pleasure to be with CNPA and all of you, so I appreciate the invitation. I am not going to give you the long version of the introduction of Leon Panetta because it's very, very long. I assume most of you are, or if all of you are familiar with Secretary Panetta's extraordinary record of service. So rather than go through his resume, though, I thought what I would do is take a moment to describe for you some of the ways in which that resume and that career have affected our lives. As a member of Congress, Leon Panetta blocked offshore oil drilling in California. As budget director and chief of staff to Bill Clinton, he helped balance the federal budget and pave the way for the longest and broadest economic expansion in modern American history. Bill Clinton, as you may recall, is the first and only president since Eisenhower to leave his successor with a budget surplus. As Secretary of Defense, Secretary Panetta helped wind down 2 wars, allowed gays to serve openly in the military, and cleared the way for women to serve in combat positions. And as director of the CIA, he oversaw a broad challenge to al-Qaeda that included the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. Because of my friend Leon Panetta, our coasts are clearer, our economy is healthier, and our security has been protected. That is no small feat. I had the great honor of working with Secretary Panetta on his memoirs, and in addition to an honor, it was a wonderful pleasure, as it is today, for me to be able to introduce him to you, ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Leon Panetta. So it's hard to know which order to take these scandals in, but let me ask you. Trump, obviously, the question of Trump's relationships with Russia are very much under the spotlight. Now we have Mueller is going to run as a special counsel. I literally 2 minutes ago got a note. The Washington Post is running a story saying that that Trump has been named a person of special interest in the investigation. There's a million questions I could ask you about this, but if we could start maybe with this conversation that he had with the Russian diplomats, the Foreign Affairs Secretary and the ambassador the other day. I know from our experience that the president clearly does have the right to declassify material, and presumably, I assume you would agree that he probably therefore didn't do anything illegal there. But what is your sense of the process, if any, that has gone through to the decision to, and went into making the decision to give the Russians that kind of information, whether you think it's, forget whether it's legal for a moment, whether it's wise to have done so?
Well, Jim, first of all, good to see you.
Likewise.
My thanks to all of you. I've spoken to this group during various parts of my political career, but I've always had a great deal of respect for the work that you do. I'm glad to see that there are people in the room still to be able to talk to, because I know the challenges that all of you face. But let me just say that I hope all of you will continue to do the great work that you do, because I think it is critical to our democracy to have newspapers that can present fair and objective news to their readership. Our democracy doesn't function without information and without the kind of careful presentation of the news that has to be done at a time when we're besieged by the internet and by all kinds of shows on television, 24-hour news shows that have their own slant on the news. So I hope you'll stick with it, and I hope you'll continue to be able to make our local newspapers something that will always be there for me and for my children. So thank you for doing that. On the issue of Trump presenting classified information to a foreign adversary of ours.
Did you ever think he'd say those words?
Look, I don't have to tell you all that that intelligence is critical to the ability of a president and the leadership of our country to be able to protect our security. No president can effectively protect this country unless they get good, accurate, reliable intelligence on what our adversaries are up to. That intelligence is not easy to get. It requires a tremendous amount of effort to get that intelligence. You got to go out and recruit sources, recruit spies to be able to get that information, because in order to get good intelligence, you've got to have spies who are willing to work in some very dangerous places, namely usually close to those that they're trying to determine what they're up to, enemies of the United States. I will tell you, in terms of the operations that I was involved with at the CIA in going after al-Qaeda's leadership in Pakistan, that we would never have been able to do that. You can put as many drones in the air as you want, but you can never really do effective targeting without people on the ground who are telling you where those targets are. And they put their lives on the line. It is tough business. So when you get intelligence from those kinds of very sensitive sources that are out there, you really have to protect them. Because if you just simply say, we got this intelligence from so-and-so who's out there in the middle of Yemen or wherever, it isn't going to be long before that person winds up dead. And so we are very protective of that kind of information. And in particular, obviously, the President of the United States should be protective of that intelligence. I mean, you can share, at least information about the threats that, we're concerned about, without having to give away the intelligence that leads you to that kind of information. So, I don't know, I guess it was McMaster who said that Trump was not fully aware of the sensitivity of the information. And that may very well be true. If that was true, then the staff to the president failed in their job to fully inform the president about the importance of protecting that kind of classified information. Because the danger is that once he presents that information, and if he does tie it to potential sources that are out there, the Russians are not dumb about this stuff. It'll only take them a very short period of time to be able to pin down where those sources are located. And then those sources, obviously, are going to be jeopardized. I imagine that Israel is very concerned about, if Israel was the source of that information, that they would be very concerned about the potential impact on their sources. Mossad, or their intelligence operation, is a group that we work very closely with at the CIA. And so I know how sensitive their sources are, because their sources happen to be in some pretty dangerous places. So I think it was a terrible, terrible mistake to allow the president to reveal that kind of information. It clearly damages our potential sources. I mean, we rely on Israel, if it is Israel, we rely on them and other intelligence agencies in other countries to give us information. We share information. We get information about threats, we share that with the British and the French and others. And that's the nature of how you gather intelligence. And if they're going to be concerned about presenting sensitive intelligence to the United States because they don't know if their sources are going to be jeopardized, then it begins to hurt not only the intelligence we present to the president, it hurts our national security. So, terrible mistake, shouldn't have happened. The fact that it did happen does not, I think at this point, involve, as far as I know, any violation of law, but it involves endangering our national security. And for a president of the United States to do that, I think it represents a very dangerous indication that the president is not being properly briefed or staffed in order to protect that kind of information from going out.
If you imagine you're back at CIA and you sent a subordinate to meet with his or her Russian counterpart to talk about Syria, Middle East, ISIS, if you learned that that subordinate had released classified information to his or her Russian counterpart, what would your response be?
Fire them.
Fire. So the only thing that makes this different is that it's the president. All right, case closed.
And
would this have had the same? I mean, set aside the sort of political reverberations of this, because of course, whatever Trump's fascination with Russia, it seems to cloud a lot of his decision making. But would this have had the same national security implications if he had released this information to the British or the French, someone who we have an ongoing, less adversarial relationship with?
well, you know, again, if he was meeting with British intelligence or meeting with British leadership, you still have to be careful about the information you present, because you're just not sure what that leader will do with that information.
Right.
And the fact is, look, you can present that information based on the kind of threats we're concerned about. I mean, you can say, these are the threats, you know, that we've been informed are out there, and we want to work with you to protect against those threats, without revealing sources, without revealing, you know, where that intelligence came from.
Although my understanding is that even if he did not, and they of course say that he did not release the source of the information, that there's the information itself may make it easy to determine who the source is.
Yeah, no. If you know, if your information is that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon at one of their underground sites, and that's the intelligence you're providing, sensitive, classified information. Well, hell, then, you know, what you immediately do if you're Iran and you get an indication that it's happening is you go to where that site is and you go after everybody who's there.
Of course.
And you eventually find out where the source is. So it endangers their lives.
Right. Even without explicitly
Yeah,
doing
no,
so.
exactly. So it's just, in the intelligence arena, this is something that just is not done because of the fact that you put lives at risk.
Correct. Do you know Bob Mueller?
I know Bob Mueller very well. Worked with him when he was FBI director. Knew him even before that. He was U.S. Attorney in San Francisco and U.S. Attorney back east in a couple places. And I had a very good relationship with him. He's somebody who is, you know, very, very straightforward, does the job, doesn't, you know, he really doesn't invest in his ego in those jobs. He basically wants to get the job done. And that's what he did as FBI director. Normally, prior to my being CIA director, there was always a kind of fractious relationship between CIA director and FBI director, because everybody's, you know, in many ways the problem in 9/11 was that everybody was stovepiped. Everybody was doing their own thing, different intelligence agencies, FBI and others, and there wasn't really an effort to work together and share information and work together to go after our enemies. That changed after 9/11. A lot of changes were made. A lot of intelligence sources were developed. The FBI developed intelligence sources within the country, and they developed a whole counterintelligence capability that frankly wasn't there before 9/11, and Bob Mueller is largely responsible for having done that. He is, without question, the very best choice that could have been made to take over as special counsel. Now, you know, we've been subjected to a lot of stories, a lot of rumors, a lot of things coming off of the Hill, coming out of the White House, you know, a lot of churning that's gone on with regards to all of the information that's involved in all of these issues, particularly with regards to the Russian investigation. I will tell you one thing, Bob Mueller is not going to do that. He'll report, obviously, if he has to the Hill and to the committees. He'll probably want to do it in closed session. He is a prosecutor who will try to gather the evidence and the facts and then make a decision as to whether or not any prosecutions ought to be brought. He is very careful, and he will not do anything to jeopardize his case. Mm-hmm. And for members of Congress, that can be very upsetting, because this, they've been basically playing this issue out in the newspapers and in the media almost every day. So there are going to be some frustrated members of Congress as a result of the appointment of Bob Mueller.
It may just go quiet for a while.
But I also think, for the sake of finding the truth, which is what this should be all about, for the sake of finding the truth, they couldn't have picked a better person to do that. And it may take some time. He is extremely careful. He will use his people very carefully to go after every bit of evidence. And so, I suspect that we're looking at an investigation that could take 6 to 9 months.
Is that right? So you don't think years, though?
This is not going to get shut down that fast.
Right, got it. All right, so that's this week's scandal. Last week's was about the firing of Jim Comey. One of the things that complicated that, as all of you know, is that we got sort of different stories on different days as to why that happened. But let's take just Trump's own account of this, as he gave it to Lester Holt. He says the two of them had dinner, that Comey asked him to stay on the job, that Trump responded in part by asking whether he was under investigation. Why is that not enough to establish obstruction? I mean, if indeed this notion, in the same conversation, they're asking, can I keep my job, and he's asking whether he's under investigation, does that not imply him attempting to interfere with that investigation, or is that just not enough?
Well, again, in order to make a case, you got to find the facts, and you got to make sure that the facts are there.
Yeah.
We're working off stories right now of people's interpretation of both what's in the notes and what happened. So it's dangerous to come to any conclusion as to whether or not that involves obstruction of justice without proving, every piece of this, and without obviously interviewing Comey and without interviewing others that were part of that. Let me just make a comment that concerns me, because I have tremendous respect for the office of the presidency. And, regardless of whether you vote for or against this guy, he is president of the United States. And you want the president to succeed for the sake of the country. What concerns me right now is that we're dealing with, in many ways, what I would call a tale of two presidencies. One is, on the national security side, I have a lot of respect for the people that he's appointed to the national security team. I've worked with McMaster. I've worked with Jim Mattis, who was my head of CENTCOM during the time I was secretary. Worked with John Kelly, who was my military aide at the Pentagon. Worked with Jim Coates, who's DNI, Director of National Intelligence. Worked with Mike Pompeo. He's got some good people. Rex Tillerson I never worked with, but I have a lot of respect for people that work with him and say he's a good man. So I think he's got a good national security team, and he's been willing to listen to them, which is also important. So, and as a result of that, a lot of the crazy positions he took during the campaign, he's backed off of. Whether it's to get rid of NATO or tear up this or, do that, he's basically walked back from a lot of those positions. And I think in large measure because of his national security team. He also took the action in Syria, which I thought was important to do, a limited attack based on the use of chemical weapons there. So I feel a lot better about, the people that are on the national security team and the fact that he relies on them. On the domestic side of the ledger, it really concerns me because I don't know that that quality of individual is there. I think, as a matter of fact, I think the White House is a place where there are too many competing centers of power. You can't run the White House with a bunch of people who are titled advisors or consuls to the president and don't carry any portfolio. All they do is basically run around and they talk and they go into meetings and they give their views and they have no responsibilities. It's a terrible way to run the White House. I know, because I became chief of staff at the time. I mean, when Bill Clinton asked me to become chief of staff, I said, "Are you kidding?" I knew how bad things were at the White House. And I'll never forget, after I took the job, I went to Mac McClarty and I said, "Mac, I'd like to see an organization chart for the White House." And he said, "You know, I don't believe I have one of those." Man. And so the White House had people who were carrying these titles, and they go into meetings, and meetings in the Oval Office, there'd be 50 people in the Oval Office. And they'd all bullshit and get nothing done. So, I mean, my approach to it was I had to establish a chain of command and I think that's the only way you can run the White House. I think if you're going to be chief of staff, you got to have one chief of staff, and everybody else should respond to that chief of staff. You've got to have a set of people that you're responsible to. You can't just wander around. So I think the concern I have is that that organization is not there. And it isn't providing the support that the president needs when he's dealing with these issues. So, he's going off and he tweets and he does this and he does that and he says things without having somebody basically saying, "Mr. President, can't say that." Somebody's got to be a grown-up in terms of the operation, and that's not there now. And so you've got somebody who's erratic, impulsive, saying the things that he's saying, and creating a very dangerous situation for the office of the presidency. So I think it's critical if this president's going to survive, and it becomes a day-to-day thing right now. But if this president's going to survive, he's going to have to reorganize that part of the White House. Otherwise, I think he'll be in danger. Because there is no there. So, when these stories come out about, meeting with the FBI director, for God's sakes, the the consul to the president or the chief of staff said you don't meet with the FBI director. You don't. When I was chief of staff, Bill Clinton said he wanted to meet with the FBI director. I said, no. You don't do that. The FBI director is independent. And if you're going to be meeting with the FBI director, that's a dangerous moment, because the FBI director is doing investigations. They're doing, looking at different issues, and you do not want to be seen as in any way affecting that kind of investigation. That's the reason an FBI director is appointed for 10 years, to be independent. So, not having somebody who says to the president, "You are not going to meet with the FBI director." Somebody who says, regardless of your concerns about what's happening with the Russian investigation, that investigation has to be separate. And it has to operate separately. Mr. President, you got too damn much to do just dealing with the issues that you want to get done in the Congress. So there isn't that kind of discipline. There isn't that kind of control about what's going on, and I think the result is you've got a guy who has, no experience, no political experience, no governing experience, basically a real estate developer who thinks that he could just sit down with anybody and bully them to drop an investigation. It's crazy. He's not operating in New York City. He's operating in the capital of the United States. So there's just got to be, more discipline there. And I don't know whether that's going to happen. He's 70 years old. Is he really going to change the way he operates? I don't know. But I think for the sake of the country, he absolutely has to do that.
We're going to turn to you all for questions in just a second, but I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if I didn't ask the $64,000 one. Do you, and this isn't sort of in parts, do you see on the record so far anything that to your mind would rise to the level of an impeachable offense, if true? How do you rate the chances that he will be impeached, and do you think that would be good for the country?
Well, I never think impeachment is never good for the country in the sense that it creates tremendous disruption within the country, impacts on our economy, impacts on our foreign affairs, impacts on our national security. So it's not a good thing for this country to go through. At the same time, if evidence is found that that in fact happened, we are a country that operates by the rule of law, and no president is above the law. So the issue then becomes, there's an awful lot here that the FBI director is going to be looking at and that the committees in the Congress are going to be looking at. What are they? Number one, the FBI director puts memos in a file that says the president told him to drop the investigation on Mike Flynn. Pretty close to obstruction of justice.
It sounds like it to me.
So the real question is, do you have the evidence to basically back that up? But I kind of, would put that near the top. Two, the firing of Director Comey. Initially explained by the White House as being related to Comey and his behavior, particularly with regards to the email situation, and then the president himself said, no, that's baloney. I fired him, I was going to fire him all the time. And the president basically indicated that the Russian investigation had something to do with this. Again, who the hell is briefing the President of the United States? And by the way, I just think that's one of the dangers of having a president who tweets. I mean, that would be the first thing I'd take away from him, Chief of Staff. So he's now raised the implication that the Russian investigation was a concern. So the issue is whether or not, the firing of Comey was aimed at trying to interfere with the Russian investigation. It could be another possible obstruction. Third is the whole issue of the Russian investigation and what Russia did in terms of trying to interfere with our election, and whether or not there was collusion with the Trump campaign. And there have been obviously a number of contacts. Every one of those is going to be looked at and to determine exactly what went on. And whether or not any of this is connected to the president. I don't know. If he's an individual of interest, obviously they're going to be looking at all of these pieces. And to some extent, I think one thing that's obvious, Trump is very transparent. He's just, and the way he behaves about the Russian issue raises a hell of a lot of concern, because why, if there's nothing there, why does he keep bending over so much to try to make sure that there is no investigation? Mm-hmm. And why does he continue to defend the Russians? And why does he continue to, to say that there's nothing there? If there's nothing there, he ought to relish the fact that this thing is being investigated to determine that there isn't anything there and get it over with. So the whole issue of the Russian investigation and whether there are any ties there raises another area that could be looked at. And then add to that, if the president is taping, if there really are tapes of conversations, where does that lead you?
Well, you can't make
if
this
you
stuff
suddenly,
up.
if that's true, and I don't know that it's true, but if it is true, where does that take you? Because if he's telling the FBI director not to conduct investigations, who else is he trying to pressure in terms of other issues? And then lastly, this whole issue with classified information. I don't know, again, that any law was violated and presidents can declassify, but there are intelligence rules and standards and guidelines about how you deal with this kind of information that could involve some possible violations that may not be impeachable, but that certainly reflect carelessness on the part of the President of the United States. So there's a number of areas here, you know, and then as you go in and investigate these areas, other areas are going to pop up. Because if you're careless enough to have produced 5 or 6 areas that they're being looked at, in my book, there are probably other areas that are out there that are going to pop up during the course of an investigation. So, you know, is this ultimately going to lead somewhere, and is it going to happen? I don't know the answer to that. It could lead nowhere. And the fact is, having a prosecutor with the integrity and reputation of Bob Mueller look at this stuff, he's got very high standards when it comes to prosecuting people. He's not going to just prosecute somebody for the sake of prosecuting them. He's going to make damn sure that he can win that. And if there's a lot of rumor and talk and stuff that doesn't make a viable case, then it may not lead anywhere. But the most important thing for the country and for all of you is that we have to determine the truth. And I don't give a damn who's president of the United States. No president has been able to stop the search for the truth. And that's a good thing about our country.
The Secretary needs to leave promptly today, so I don't want to cut off myself too soon, or to wait too long. So why don't we turn it over to all of you? Who's got a question to ask here? And do we have I think we have microphones circulating, right? So maybe I can hand you one.
Thank you. Oh, okay. I hate to do this, but it's so apropos. I'm looking at the latest breaking news from the New York Times. It says that some official who was present at the meeting has a document summarizing the meeting with the Russian officials, in which Trump said, "I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I faced great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off."
Holy shit.
Now, I'm not going to ask for
Okay,
your...
that's in the time that we've been sitting up here.
Exactly. and that's what I wanted to talk about. You know, there's the famous term, the fog of war. And we're in the fog of politics, I think, at this point, where everything changes from minute to minute. And what happens is that none of us are able to focus clearly. We don't have the kind of calm deliberation that our government is used to for important decisions like this. How do you think that's affected? Why do you think that's happened? And how do you think it's affected the ability of our democracy to operate properly?
Yeah, you know, as Jim knows, I've told him I've seen Washington at its best, and I've seen Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. In the time I was in the Congress, both as a legislative assistant to Tom Kuechel, as well as a member of Congress, elected when Tip O'Neill was Speaker, Bob Michel was Minority Leader, it was a time when Republicans and Democrats worked together. And there was a willingness to, to work on the important issues facing the country. And we did. We worked together. I was a ranking member on the Budget Committee. I worked with my Republican counterpart. Did the same thing on the Agriculture Committee. And as a result of that, whether it was a Democratic president or a Republican president like Ronald Reagan, the fact is we got a hell of a lot accomplished. We did immigration reform. We did tax reform. We did budgets. We worked on energy issues. We worked on education issues. And a lot was done. And that's the way our system's supposed to work. In the last 12, 15 years, I've never seen Washington as bad as I've seen it today. And that, I've had about a 50-year career in public life. And the reality is that it's very divided, it's very partisan. Both parties are in their trenches. Nobody wants to come out and work on the issues. They're both out to kill each other and to try to stop the other side. And the country pays the price for that. Frankly, I think, in many ways, it led to this last election. There were a lot of angry and frustrated people out there who thought, Washington, I don't give a damn whether you're Republican or Democrat, I'm not doing a damn thing for you. And so they elect somebody who they may have had concerns about, but they figured this guy's going to blow things up. And a lot of that is due to this dysfunction in Washington. And the dysfunction is due to a lot of things. It's due to, redistricting, where you've got safe Republican and Democratic seats, and people are worried about people running to the extremes, so you're losing the center of politics in this country. There's a hell of a lot of money in politics now, a lot of special interests that have an impact. They don't want anything changing. There's the media, they're looking for sound bites. They aren't looking for news. They're looking for sound bites. And the party feeds them the sound bites. And as a result of that, the leadership is not willing to take risks. If you're going to lead, you got to take risks. They're not willing to take risks anymore. And so it's all a game of survival. And I think when issues start to break like this, instead of having this kind of partisan rap back and forth as to, who's going to investigate, what committees are going to do it, who's trying to play with the White House, who's trying to, Democrats trying to go after the whole process, they would be working together. This is a serious issue facing the country. If the president said what he said to the Russians, that's serious. Russia is an adversary. What the hell is he doing? Russia does not have our interests at heart. They are a threat to our interests. They've always been a threat to our interests. Who are we kidding? And so, the committees ought to be working together to try to deal with that, rather than having this ugly partisanship and divide that's taking place. And it's reflected in the media, and it's reflected in the concern of the American people, who then, frankly, don't know who the hell to trust in this process. So somehow we have got to get back to governing the country. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I thought, frankly, what was needed is a president who was willing to say to both parties, we are going to work together. When I was there and we had deficits of what, $350, $400 billion. That was a big deal in those days. And President of the United States plus the leadership told us, Republicans and Democrats, you're going to get in a room and you're not going to come out of that damn room until you have a budget agreement worked out. That's the honest to God truth. And we had everything on the table. We had defense, we had non-defense, we had entitlements, we had taxes, all on the table. You're not going to deal with the size deficits we're facing today, or the debt we're facing today, unless you're willing to put everything on the table and do it. But you need the leadership to back you up, and a president who's willing to back up the leadership. And I thought, frankly, to be truthful, that Donald Trump, who's not a Republican or a Democrat, if he were really working at this and he had somebody with experience, you could begin to put together a working coalition that can get you things done. There are deals to be cut here. You can cut a deal on immigration reform. You could cut a deal on health care. You could cut a deal on tax reform. Hopefully you could cut a deal on the budget. But it takes real leadership and a willingness to face up to that. And that's not there now, and so anytime these stories break, there is chaos, nobody controls anything, there's no leadership to kind of put together a strategy to deal with these threats to the country. And frankly, let me tell you, it is hurting the status of the United States. I've said this country can go in one of two directions. We could be an America in Renaissance in the 21st century, or we could be an America in decline. And if we continue to operate by crisis instead of leadership, we will be a country in decline. So that's the choice we're going to have to make. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do know what the problem is and what needs to be addressed.
Please, sir. Just a point of information, if after 9 or 10 months of investigation, the director of the FBI determines that he does not have evidence to bring charges of a crime, will he announce that fact and that's the end of it, or will we actually see some?
No, I think Bob Mueller will announce the conclusions of that investigation. There's no question in my mind that he will do that, but he will not do it until he's very certain of what the consequences are going to be. I suspect, look, I don't know for sure, but I suspect, just on the basis of some of the things that have gone on with the Russian issue and Mike Flynn, there's going to be some prosecutions here. There'll be some prosecutions. How high it goes, how much is implied by virtue of those prosecutions, I don't know the answer to that. But, something's going to come out of this. It isn't all going to be shut down. But are the Democrats going to be happy with what comes out of it? Are the Republicans going to be happy? I don't know the answer to that question. Will the American people be happy with it? But I'll tell you one thing. I will trust Bob Mueller's judgment as to what he ultimately decides to do, because I think he is interested in finding the truth.
Flynn seems like the most exposed at this point, right? Would you agree that Flynn?
I think Flynn, because of what he did, the money he accepted, and the fact that he lied about a lot of things he was doing. And frankly, the fact is, he asked for immunity. You don't ask for immunity unless you're trying to protect your rear end.
Right. Next. Oh, here we go, yeah. I think it's coming to you.
Secretary, thank you. I just have a question more about Russia. It seems like I'm just curious on your insights on Russia. I mean, if they are this serious adversary, I'm kind of wondering, back when you guys were in office, I don't remember hearing that it was almost like the Cold War was over, and then it was a late, great misunderstanding. And then I never heard anything about the Russians again. And then about 3 weeks ago, all of a sudden, it's like, they're our adversary. They're going to kill us. If they're going to kill us, what are we doing against them, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to hear that.
Well, we've been through an interesting period with Russia going back to the end of World War II. And even during World War II, you read the histories on World War II. Franklin Roosevelt was trying to figure out whether Joe Stalin was a friend or an enemy, and was hoping that he could work with the Russians to be able to provide peace after World War II. And then, Harry Truman looked at what the Russians were doing behind the Iron Curtain, and was very concerned that they were interested in, continuing to spread communism, and developed NATO, developed the whole Atlantic Treaty group, and made every effort to check Russia in that process. And then, we went through Korea, we went through a lot of other things, and continued to be concerned about the Soviet Union and what they were trying to do. So there's been a long history here where we've been confronting the Soviet Union and the threats that they represented, and the Soviet Union was, has basically, this is not, I can tell you the Russians over a long period of time have made efforts to spy on the United States and get information and destabilize the United States. That's what they do. We kind of knew that. I mean, I sit down with the head of Russian intelligence, and at the CIA, we had a picture of a guy who was a Russian who turned on the Russians and became a great source for us. We have a picture up in the CIA. And I remember asking, my Russian counterpart, we were at a dinner, and saying, what concerns you the most? He says, the picture of that spy. That, no question. That went to the heart of his concerns. There was, as a result of efforts by a number of presidents, recognizing, that you still try to deal even with an adversary. There were efforts, particularly with a nuclear power adversary, efforts to try to control nuclear weapons, and so there was a period of negotiations that took place to try to reduce the nuclear threat. So, at the same time that we were competing on a number of fronts, we were trying to work together in some areas where we could try to find some agreement. When I was there, Medvedev, who was president at the time, even though I think Putin was still the power, Medvedev was actually doing some outreach on nuclear issues. We were working together on, frankly, terrorism issues. They had Chechnya, we were worried about Al-Qaeda, so we were doing some work together. Even as CIA director, I was working with Russian intelligence on going after some terrorists together. So there were areas of cooperation that were taking place. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a sense that we could begin perhaps another era of trying to work together with Russia. I think what happened, by the way, while we were talking to Medvedev at the CIA and with Bob Mueller, who was at the FBI, we located 10 Russian spies that Russia put into this country. And what they did was they sent people at a very young age to come into the country. This is an old Soviet Union tactic. You send them in, they become part of their community, they get married, they send their children to school, they become part of Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs, and eventually they try to get into sensitive positions, and they become spies. We knew there were 10 of them in the United States. And we had to arrest the 10, and we did. So that gives you, at least some sense of this kind of love-hate relationship that you can have with an adversary. I think what changed was that Putin, when he became president, his fundamental goal is to try to restore the old Soviet Union. He thought everything that happened from the fall of the Berlin Wall hurt Russia. So his basic goal was to try to restore the old Soviet Union in his own way and to try to diminish the influence of the United States. Putin, I think, read weakness in the United States and that nobody was really going to take him on. And that's why when he went into the Ukraine, when he went into Crimea, and nobody stopped him, I think that was a message that to him represented weakness. And I think in addition to that, when he went into Syria, nobody stopped him from going into Syria. I think that represented problems. And I think he thought it was at a point where he could take advantage of the United States in a number of ways. The intelligence people were always aware of that, and we continue to have pretty good intelligence on what the Russians were up to. And I think that if you draw a line with Putin and make very clear that we are not going to allow him to cross certain lines, for example, if he moved into another former Soviet Union country, I think he'd have to be stopped, and NATO would have to stop him militarily. And he should know that. And we are going to check him in terms of, what he's trying to do in Syria. He's got to know where the lines are. If he knows where the lines are, you can deal with Putin. But if he thinks you're weak, then he will take advantage of you. And I think that's what he's doing. And that's why it's really important for our own national security to be able to be aware of that, to know how they're operating, and to be able to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen in the future.
You have time for one more? Should we? Okay, one more quick one, please.
So we are finding a lot of information that's leaking out of the White House, and that's one thing I'd like you to address, how that you managed it in the past and what your reflections are on it.
Yeah.
And also, if you could, since we're all press, if you can comment upon the relationship between the White House and the press.
I said a quick one.
Okay. On the first part, there isn't a president, and I've worked under 9 presidents in the 50 years I've been in public life. There isn't one of those presidents that was not outraged by leaks. When I became chief of staff, Bill Clinton was saying, everybody's a leaker, they're all running around, fire them, get rid of them, investigate it, and what have you. And my approach to it as chief of staff is that you are, in a situation where there is no authority, staff members are likely to leak because they're doing it to either hurt somebody in the White House. I mean, I don't think they try to deliberately hurt the president, but I think they try to hurt somebody in the White House. They try to develop relationships with the press because it gives them some ego satisfaction to be able to talk with somebody in the press who's listening to them. So there are a lot of factors at play. The only way you deal with it, the only way I thought you deal with it, is that you have to create a sense of team within the White House, a sense that you're all part of one team and that you're all loyal to the president, and that these leaks can damage the presidency. And I mean, the way I approached it was basically to try to, I had an early morning staff meeting with top staff, but then I had a general staff meeting later in the morning with all of the staff in the White House, so that they knew what was going on, so that I informed them as to what we were involved with. So I listened to their concerns at the time. And the result of that was to create a sense of team within the White House, that we were all working on the same team. That's the best way to try to control leaks, because then people are hesitant to do that because they know it creates harm. But in a situation where there isn't that kind of discipline or that sense of teamwork, then everybody is going to leak stuff. And that's what's happening now. I mean, you've got White House people and sources that are leaking every day. It's a sieve. You know, then add to that a president who's tweeting. It's chaos. Jesus, how can you run anything in that situation? Because things are leaking and hitting you. I mean, you try to plan something and then suddenly it's leaked to the press. It undermines your ability to plan things for the future. I mean, it's chaos. So if that continues, I think the White House really does unwind. You just, unless you're able to stop that in some way, unless you're able to provide discipline in the sense that everybody's part of a team, I think, particularly if they think the president's in trouble, they're going to continue to throw torpedoes out there. And that's not a good situation. It isn't. The relationship with the press is, this is a time when, I worry about the president who has, clearly is targeting the press as the enemy here. And that one of the keys to his argument to the country is that, whatever you're reading, whatever you're seeing, whatever is being investigated is a witch hunt, is not true, is false news, and is due to the press. And the press is the enemy. And so there's no question that he's trying to target the institution of a free press as the enemy of the people. The right-wing press kind of plays into that and says, yeah, that's true. And I think the danger is going to be that the press is going to face a lot more pressure to try to remain fair and objective and stick to the facts. Because I think if the press feels that it's under siege, that there's almost a reaction that says, we're going to do everything possible to take this guy down. And I think that becomes dangerous because it begins to affect your ability to really look at the facts and at the news in an objective and fair way. So that's going to be the challenge. This is a two-pronged challenge. You've got a president who's going to make the press the enemy, but at the same time, you've got a press that has all of these scandals that are developing, a lot of news that's going on, And there will be a tendency to try to really drive that news as much as you can, sometimes even if you don't have the best sources or the best facts. And I just have to tell you that the key is for the press to be as responsible as possible in these difficult times. And it's not going to be easy, because your readership is going to want to, come on, what's the latest horrible thing that's happened? You've got a tremendous responsibility on your shoulders. But I think in the end, the American people, and look, that's really what this is all about, is the American people. And I have to tell you that for everything that's going on, I have tremendous trust in the judgment and common sense of the American people. And you have to believe that as well. Because I think in the end, they really do read your papers, they read the news, they want to find out what's going on. And to the extent that you can give them the facts, I think the American people, as a result of that, will reject these attacks and will say, in the United States of America, if we want to protect our democracy, we have to protect a free press. Thanks very much for having me.